You think you can just show up and replace her?
At just 18, Josie Miller was sold for the price of 3 good horses to a brooding, widowed mountain man named Gideon Hayes. She expected a life of brutal servitude in the unforgiving Rockies. What she found, however, was a deadly secret that would set the entire frontier ablaze. The year was 1878, and the Kansas prairie had dried up into a cracked, unforgiving husk. For the Miller family, the relentless drought meant the difference between survival and starvation. 18-year-old Josie Miller sat on the porch of their decaying farmhouse, the dry wind whipping her cotton dress around her ankles. She watched her father, John, hand over a sealed envelope to a rider from the Wells Fargo stage line. She didn't know it yet, but inside that envelope was her fate, signed and sealed in ink. A week later, John Miller sat his daughter down at the scarred kitchen table. He couldn't meet her eyes. He spoke of a man up in the high country of the Colorado Territory near the mining camp of Silverton, a trapper and homesteader named Gideon Hayes. Gideon had lost his wife to winter fever the year prior, leaving him with 2 young children. He had written to a broker in Kansas City, offering a small fortune in gold dust enough to save the Miller farm from the bank in exchange for a respectable young woman willing to come west and be a mother to his children. "It's a hard ask, Josie," her father had muttered, his voice cracking beneath the weight of his own failure. "But it's honorable work. He's a God-fearing man, they say. And the money, it pays off the mortgage. It saves your brothers." Josie didn't cry. She had grown up too fast on the frontier to believe in fairy tale romances. Love was a luxury for city folks. Out here, survival was the only currency that mattered. She packed her few meager belongings into a single leather trunk, embraced her weeping mother, and boarded a westbound train. The journey was a grueling blur of soot, rattling tracks, and bone-deep exhaustion. The flat, yellow plains gradually gave way to the terrifying majesty of the Rocky Mountains. By the time Josie stepped off the narrow-gauge railroad at the Silverton Depot, the air was so thin and cold it burned her lungs. The town was a chaotic, muddy sprawl of prospectors, saloon girls, and rough-hewn timber buildings. She stood on the wooden boardwalk, shivering in a wool shawl that was entirely inadequate for the mountain chill, waiting for a husband she had never met. "Miss Miller?" The voice was like grinding stones. Josie turned and found herself looking far up into the face of Gideon Hayes. He was a mountain of a man, clad in a heavy buckskin coat lined with wolf fur. His face was weathered like old saddle leather, obscured by a thick, dark beard. A jagged, faded scar cut through his left eyebrow, disappearing into his hairline. But it was his eyes that struck her most. They were a piercing, icy blue, holding a depth of sorrow and hardness that made her breath catch in her throat. "I am," Josie replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. She squared her shoulders, refusing to let him see her tremble. "You are Mr. Hayes." "Gideon," he corrected gruffly, effortlessly, lifting her heavy leather trunk onto his shoulder as if it weighed no more than a sack of feathers. "We have a long ride up the ridge. Sun's dropping. Keep close." He didn't offer a hand, nor did he offer a word of comfort. They mounted a pair of sturdy, thick-coated Mustangs and began the ascent out of the valley. For 3 hours, they rode in heavy silence through dense, ancient pine forests. The higher they climbed, the more isolated the world became. The noise of the mining town vanished, replaced by the eerie, overwhelming silence of the high timberline, broken only by the crunch of hooves on frost-hardened earth. When they finally reached the homestead, the last light of day was bleeding red over the jagged peaks. The cabin was a sturdy, well-built structure of heavy logs, nestled against a steep rock face that protected it from the brutal northern winds. Smoke curled invitingly from the stone chimney. As Gideon helped her down from her horse, the heavy oak door of the cabin cracked open. 2 small faces peered out into the gathering gloom. "Caleb, Cora," Gideon called out, his deep voice softening just a fraction. "Come out here." A boy of about 7 stepped onto the porch. He had his father's dark hair, but carried a look of fierce, defensive anger in his young eyes. Clinging to his pant leg was a little girl, no older than 4, clutching a tattered rag doll. They stared at Josie not with curiosity, but with the fearful suspicion of wild animals. "This is Josie," Gideon said, stepping between them. "She's going to be staying with us. You will treat her with respect. Understood?" Caleb didn't answer. He just glared at Josie, turned on his heel, and retreated into the cabin, pulling his little sister with him. Gideon sighed, a heavy, exhausted sound. He turned to Josie, the coldness returning to his gaze. "I didn't bring you here to be my wife in anything but name, Josie. The marriage certificate was just to satisfy the law and your father. I need someone to cook, keep the hearth warm, and make sure my children don't turn into wolves while I'm out checking the trap lines. That's the bargain. Do we understand each other?" Josie looked from the towering, scarred man to the dark doorway where the children had vanished. She was 18, completely cut off from the world she knew, standing in the shadow of unforgiving mountains with a family entirely broken by grief. "I understand the bargain, Mr. Hayes," Josie said, her voice ringing clear in the crisp mountain air. "I'll do my part, but if you want me to raise those children, you don't undermine me in my own house." Gideon stared at her for a long moment, a flicker of something akin to surprise and perhaps a grudging respect crossing his stoic features. He gave a single, curt nod. "Fair enough," he murmured. He pushed the door open. "Welcome home." The first month at the homestead tested the absolute limits of Josie's endurance. The reality of frontier life at 8,000 feet was brutal. Her days began long before dawn, breaking the ice in the water bucket, coaxing a fire from the dying embers, and kneading heavy dough for the day's bread. Her hands, once soft, quickly grew calloused and blistered. Gideon was a ghost in his own home. He would leave before sunrise, his Winchester rifle slung over his shoulder, disappearing into the snowy wilderness to check his trap lines, returning only when the stars were bright and sharp in the night sky. He provided plenty of meat venison, elk, and rabbit, but offered little in the way of conversation. He slept on a cot in the main room by the fire, leaving the small back bedroom to Josie and the children. Winning over Caleb and Cora was a battlefield of its own. Cora, the 4-year-old, was a silent shadow. She hadn't spoken a word since her mother passed. Josie didn't push her. Instead, she took to humming old hymns while she worked, leaving small, warm pieces of sweetened cornbread near where the girl played. One evening, while Josie was darning socks by the hearth, Cora silently climbed onto the wooden bench beside her and rested her head against Josie's arm. Josie didn't stop her humming, but she gently draped a wool blanket over the girl's shoulders. It was a fragile, quiet victory. Caleb, however, was a different story. He was a boy drowning in an ocean of unexpressed grief, and he directed all his fury at the stranger trying to take his mother's place. He would deliberately track mud across the freshly scrubbed floorboards, hide Josie's sewing needles, and refuse to eat the meals she cooked. The breaking point came in late November. Josie had spent 3 days meticulously washing, drying, and mending an old quilt she found in the storage chest to put on Caleb's bed. When she walked into the room, she found Caleb standing over the quilt, tearing at the newly mended seams with a pocket knife, his face streaked with angry tears. "It's my mother's," he screamed as Josie rushed in and grabbed his wrist. "You can't touch it! You aren't her! You're nothing but a stray dog Pa bought!" The words stung like a physical blow, snapping something inside Josie. She wrested the knife from his grip and shoved him back. "You're right," Josie snapped, her own voice trembling with months of pent-up exhaustion and loneliness. "I am not your mother, and I don't want to be. I am an 18-year-old girl who was sold to a stranger, and I am doing the best I can to keep you from freezing or starving to death. You think you're the only one hurting, Caleb Hayes? You think I don't miss my home? You think I want to be in this God-forsaken cabin?" The boy froze, shocked by her outburst. The door creaked open. Gideon stood in the threshold, snow dusting his broad shoulders, having returned early from the woods. He had heard the entire exchange. He looked at the torn quilt, at Caleb's tear-streaked face, and finally at Josie, who was breathing heavily, tears welling in her own eyes. Gideon stepped into the room. He didn't yell. He looked at his son with a quiet, terrifying authority. "Caleb, go to the woodshed. Stack the split pine until I tell you to stop." Caleb didn't argue. He bolted from the room. Gideon looked at Josie. You shouldn't have to deal with his disrespect." "He's grieving, Gideon." Josie wiped her eyes fiercely, refusing to cry. "He thinks if he accepts me, he's betraying her. Don't punish him for loving his mother." Gideon stared at her, the hard lines of his face softening in the dim light. For the first time, he looked at her not as a hired hand, but as a person carrying a tremendous burden. "You have more grit than I gave you credit for, Josie Miller." It was a turning point. Over the next few weeks, a strange, unspoken truce settled over the cabin. Caleb stopped his sabotage, occasionally even helping Josie carry firewood without being asked. Gideon, too, seemed to thaw. He began lingering at the dinner table after meals, carving small wooden animals for Cora, and occasionally answering Josie's questions about the mountains. But as the domestic tension eased, a new, darker anxiety began to take root in Josie's mind. She began to notice things. Gideon's wariness wasn't just the caution of a mountain man, it was the paranoia of a hunted animal. He never sat with his back to a window. Every evening, he spent an hour meticulously cleaning his revolvers, staring out into the tree line as if expecting the shadows to come alive. And there was the matter of the locked iron-bound box beneath the floorboards in the pantry. Josie discovered it entirely by accident while chasing a persistent field mouse. A loose board shifted beneath her knee, revealing the hidden compartment. She shouldn't have pried, but curiosity overpowered her manners. The lock was old and brittle, giving way with a sharp twist of a fire poker. Inside, there were no letters from a dead wife or sentimental keepsakes. Instead, the box was lined with heavy, canvas sacks. Josie opened one, her breath catching in her throat as the dim light caught the glint of dozens of solid gold double eagle coins. Beneath the sacks lay a folded, heavily worn broadsheet from the Pinkerton Detective Agency out of Chicago. Josie unfolded it with trembling hands. The sketch on the paper was crude, but the jagged scar through the eyebrow was unmistakable. Wanted. Dead or alive. $10,000 reward. For the robbery of the Union Pacific payroll and the murder of 2 guards. Name, Silas the Reaper Vance. Josie's heart hammered against her ribs. Gideon wasn't just a widowed homesteader. He was Silas Vance. He was a wanted killer hiding in the highest, most unreachable corner of the earth. And the winter fever that supposedly took his first wife? As Josie stared at the wanted poster, a cold dread pooled in her stomach. What really happened to her? Before she could process the horrific truth, a heavy pounding echoed through the cabin. Someone was banging their fist against the heavy oak front door. Gideon was still out on the ridge. Caleb and Cora were napping in the back room. Josie scrambled to put the floorboard back, shoved the wanted poster into her apron pocket, and walked slowly to the front room. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove, holding it behind her skirt, and unlatched the door. Standing on the porch were 2 men. They wore long canvas dusters and bowler hats, their horses steaming in the cold air behind them. They didn't look like prospectors. They carried the hard, calculating stillness of professional manhunters. "Afternoon, ma'am," the taller one said, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes were like dead black coals, scanning the interior of the cabin over her shoulder. "Mighty isolated out here for a young thing like yourself. We're looking for a man, big fella, scar over his left eye, goes by the name Silas." Josie gripped the handle of the skillet, her knuckles turning white. The wind howled through the pines, sounding like a warning siren. She was an 18-year-old girl standing between 2 ruthless bounty hunters and the children of a fugitive. She forced a polite, bewildered smile onto her face. "I'm sorry, gentlemen," Josie lied, staring straight into the dead eyes of the manhunter. "My husband's name is Gideon, and you are trespassing on his land." The taller of the 2 men, a cold-eyed man who introduced himself as Operative Thomas Horn of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, didn't seem convinced. His gaze drifted past Josie's shoulder, taking in the spare details of the cabin. "Gideon, you say?" Horn's voice was smooth, like oil over glass. "That's a biblical name for a man hiding at the edge of the world. Mind if we step inside out of the wind, Mrs. Hayes? We've ridden up from the Animas River Valley, and the frostbite is setting in." Josie gripped the cast-iron skillet hidden behind her skirts so tightly her fingers ached. She knew if these men stepped inside, they would find the loose floorboard in the pantry. They would find the gold. And they would wait for Gideon. "I do mind, Mr. Horn," Josie said, forcing her voice to pitch slightly higher, playing the part of a frightened, territorial young homesteader. "My husband is a jealous man, and he's currently down in the Silverton assay office filing a quartz claim. He'd take a horsewhip to me and a shotgun to you if he found strange men warming their boots by his hearth. If you want him, you can ride back down the mountain and find him at the Imperial Saloon." Horn's companion, a younger man with a nervous twitch in his jaw, stamped his freezing feet. "She might be telling the truth, Tom. We saw tracks heading down the Durango Trail." Horn stared at Josie for a long, suffocating moment. He was weighing her words, searching for the tremor of a lie. Josie held her breath, keeping her eyes wide and innocent. Finally, Horn tipped his bowler hat. "We'll check the saloons in Silverton," Horn said, his tone carrying a subtle threat. "But if we find out you're hiding Silas McCall alias or not, harboring a federal fugitive carries a mandatory sentence at the territorial prison in Canyon City." "Good day, ma'am." They turned their horses and began the treacherous descent back into the tree line. Josie slammed the heavy oak door, dropped the skillet, and collapsed against the wood, her knees shaking so violently she could barely stand. 2 hours later, the crunch of heavy boots on snow signaled Gideon's return. He walked through the door carrying a brace of snowshoe hares, pausing instantly when he saw Josie sitting rigidly at the kitchen table. The iron-bound box was sitting open in the center of the scarred wood. The stacks of gold double eagles gleamed in the lantern light. Next to them was the wanted poster. Gideon's hand instinctively dropped to the grip of the Colt revolver at his hip. The cabin was dead silent, save for the crackle of the hearth and the muffled breathing of the children sleeping in the back room. "They were Pinkertons," Josie said, her voice eerily calm despite the terror still coursing through her veins. "A man named Thomas Horn. They were looking for Silas McCall. I told them you were in Silverton. They'll be back by tomorrow morning, when they realize I lied." Gideon didn't move. The shadows of the fire danced across his scarred face, making him look older, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. "You went through my floorboards." "And you bought me with blood money," Josie shouted, slamming her hand onto the table, the gold coins rattling against the wood. "You let me bring those children into my heart, let me mend your clothes and cook your meals, while knowing a rope was waiting for you. Who did you murder, Gideon, or should I call you Silas?" Gideon closed his eyes, a heavy, ragged sigh escaping his lungs. He walked to the table, ignoring the gold, and pulled out a chair. He looked at Josie, not with anger, but with a profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. "I never killed anyone on that Union Pacific train in Cheyenne," Gideon began, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "It was 74. I was a safe cracker, Josie. The best in the Wyoming Territory. I worked with a crew led by a man named Dutch Henry Bourne. He told me it was a clean job, blow the payroll safe, take the company scrip, and ride south. But Dutch was a butcher. When the guards surprised us, he didn't run. He gunned them down in cold blood." Josie stared at him, her chest heaving. "The poster says you pulled the trigger." "Dutch had friends in the territorial legislature," Gideon explained bitterly. "He pinned the murders on me to keep the Pinkertons off his own trail. I took my share of the gold and ran to Leadville to hide with my wife, Sarah, and my boy, Caleb. We thought we were safe." Gideon's voice broke. He reached out, his calloused fingers trembling as they traced the edge of a gold coin. "Dutch didn't want loose ends," Gideon whispered. "He sent his regulators to Leadville to silence me. I wasn't at the cabin when they arrived. Sarah held them off with a repeater rifle so Caleb could hide in the root cellar. By the time I got back, the regulators were dead on the porch, but Sarah had taken a bullet to the chest. The winter fever didn't kill my wife, Josie. Dutch Henry did, and Caleb saw the whole thing from the cracks in the floorboards." A cold shock washed over Josie. Suddenly, Caleb's furious, destructive grief made horrific sense. The boy hadn't just lost his mother. He had watched her bleed out defending him. "I took the children, changed my name, and ran as high into the Rockies as I could," Gideon finished. "I bought you, Josie, because I knew I was living on borrowed time. I needed someone strong enough to take the children and this gold and disappear if the law or Dutch ever found me. Josie looked at the imposing, terrifying mountain man, and for the first time, she didn't see a captor or a killer. She saw a desperate father who had sacrificed his own soul to keep his children breathing. Before she could process the weight of his confession, a sound pierced the howling mountain wind outside. It wasn't the howl of a wolf. It was the sharp, unmistakable metallic clack of a Winchester rifle lever being racked. "Get down!" Gideon roared. The front window of the cabin shattered inward in a hail of glass and splintered wood. Deafening gunfire echoed through the canyon as heavy lead slugs tore through the cabin's timber walls. Josie threw herself to the floor, crawling frantically toward the back bedroom as Gideon overturned the heavy oak table, creating a makeshift barricade. "Pinkertons?" Josie screamed over the roar of another volley of gunfire. "Pinkertons want you alive for the bounty," Gideon shouted back, pulling his Winchester from the scabbard by the door. "These men are shooting to kill! It's Dutch's regulators!" Josie scrambled into the bedroom. Cora was screaming, huddled beneath her quilt. Caleb was standing by the window, his face pale, eyes wide with the same terror he must have felt in that root cellar in Leadville. "Caleb, get your sister on the floor," Josie ordered, her maternal instincts completely overriding her fear. She grabbed the heavy mattress and dragged it over the two children, shielding them from the stray bullets tearing through the roof shingles. In the main room, Gideon was returning fire. The deafening booms of his rifle shook the cabin. He was a force of nature, moving with practiced, lethal precision. Two men in thick canvas dusters fell dead in the snow outside, their blood blooming like dark roses against the pristine white powder. But there were too many of them. 6 riders had surrounded the homestead. A bullet punched through the doorframe, catching Gideon in the left shoulder. He grunted, dropping to one knee behind the overturned table, his rifle slipping from his grasp. "Gideon!" Josie screamed. Without thinking, Josie crawled out from beneath the mattress. She scrambled across the floorboards, sliding on the shattered glass, and reached the hearth. She grabbed Gideon's double-barreled scattergun, which always rested fully loaded above the mantel. She crawled to Gideon's side. He was bleeding heavily, his face pale as he pressed his hand against his shattered shoulder. "Load for me," Gideon gasped, nodding toward his fallen Winchester. "I don't know how," Josie cried. "Then you shoot," he commanded, his icy blue eyes locking onto hers. "They are coming through the door, Josie. If they get past me, they will kill the children." The heavy oak door buckled under the weight of a massive, bearded regulator trying to kick it off its iron hinges. The wood splintered. The door gave way, crashing inward in a cloud of snow and dust. The regulator stepped into the threshold, raising a repeating shotgun. Josie didn't hesitate. She didn't think about her farm in Kansas, or the girl she used to be just 2 months ago. She raised the heavy scattergun, braced the stock against her shoulder, and pulled both triggers. The recoil threw her backward onto the floorboards, bruising her collarbone, but the deafening blast did its work. The regulator was thrown backward out the door, vanishing into the howling snowstorm. Silence fell over the mountain, heavy and ringing. For 10 minutes, they didn't move. Gideon kept his revolver aimed at the doorway, his breathing shallow, but no one else came through. The remaining regulators, seeing 3 of their men dead and the cabin heavily fortified, had cut their losses and fled down the ridge. Josie dragged herself up, her ears ringing, the smell of cordite and copper thick in the air. She rushed to Gideon, tearing her apron into strips to bind his bleeding shoulder. "You did good, Kansas," Gideon breathed, a faint, bloody smile touching his lips before he slumped against the wall. It took an hour to secure the cabin, drag the heavy table back against the ruined doorway, and stoke the fire. Caleb emerged from the back room, his eyes darting to the blood on the floor and then to Josie. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a fit. He simply walked over to the water basin, soaked a clean rag, and handed it to Josie to clean her soot-stained face. It was an unspoken surrender. She was family now, but the true shock was yet to come. While Gideon rested, Josie went out onto the porch to retrieve the guns from the dead regulators. As she rolled the massive, bearded man over to take his shotgun, a folded piece of parchment slipped from the inside pocket of his canvas duster. Josie picked it up. Her hands were numb from the cold, but as she unfolded the paper and read the elegant, looping handwriting, the blood in her veins turned to absolute ice. It was a letter addressed to Dutch Henry, born in Denver. Mr. Born, I have located the man you are looking for. He calls himself Gideon Hayes now. He operates a homestead up the ridge from Silverton. I know this to be true because the Kansas City broker just paid me $3,000 in gold to send my own daughter, Josie, out there to be his wife. Send your men. I expect the rest of my payment wired to the Topeka Bank upon confirmation of his death. Yours, John Miller. Josie dropped to her knees in the blood-stained snow. Her father hadn't sold her to save the farm. He had discovered who Gideon was through the broker, realized there was a bounty on the man's head from the criminal underworld, and used his own 18-year-old daughter as bait to collect the blood money from a ruthless gang. She was entirely alone in the world. The only true family she had left were the scarred fugitive bleeding by the fire and the two terrified children waiting inside. The winter of 1878 sealed the mountain pass in 50 inches of unbroken snow, turning the Hayes homestead into an impenetrable fortress of ice and isolation. For 4 months, they were cut off from the world, trapped with the ghosts of their pasts and the bloody reality of their present. Those months changed everything. Josie spent the first 3 weeks fighting to keep Gideon alive. The bullet had shattered his collarbone, bringing a raging fever that had him thrashing in the night, calling out for his dead wife. Josie sat by his cot day and night, forcing willow bark tea past his cracked lips and packing his wound with moss and clean snow. In those quiet, desperate hours, the transaction that had brought them together burned away. Caleb and Cora became her shadows. The boy who had once torn up her quilts now hauled firewood without being asked, his eyes constantly tracking the tree line with his father's Winchester resting in his small hands. Cora, who hadn't spoken since Leadville, finally broke her silence on a freezing January morning, tugging on Josie's apron and whispering, "Mama, the fire is low." When spring finally broke the valley in late April, melting the snowdrifts into roaring mountain creeks, Gideon was healed. The scars on his shoulder were thick and ugly, but his strength had returned. However, the shadow of Dutch Henry Bourne still hung over them. Gideon knew the regulators wouldn't be the last. "We can't live like hunted animals, Josie," Gideon said one evening, sharpening his hunting knife by the hearth. "Dutch won't stop until he knows I'm in the ground, and the Pinkertons will keep circling." Josie pulled her father's blood-stained letter from her apron. She had read it 100 times, the betrayal hardening her heart into something as unyielding as the Colorado granite. "Then we don't wait for them," Josie said, her voice completely devoid of the frightened 18-year-old girl she used to be. "We take the fight to Denver, and we give the Pinkertons a bigger prize." A week later, they left Caleb and Cora in the care of a trusted assayer in Silverton. Josie and Gideon boarded a stagecoach bound for the booming, chaotic metropolis of Denver. The city in 1879 was a volatile mix of high society Victorian wealth and lawless frontier grit. They didn't go to the local sheriff. Instead, Josie walked straight into the opulent lobby of the Brown Palace Hotel and asked for Thomas Horn, the cold-eyed Pinkerton operative who had visited their cabin. When Horn saw her, his hand drifted toward his coat pocket. "Mrs. Hayes, or should I say, Mrs. McCall?" "You can say whatever you like, Mr. Horn, so long as you listen," Josie replied coolly, taking a seat opposite him. She laid her father's letter on the table, along with 3 solid gold double eagles. "You want a bounty. My husband wants his life back. I am offering you the man who actually robbed the Union Pacific payroll and the man who murdered 3 of your operatives in Leadville, Dutch Henry Bourne." Horn read the letter, his dead eyes narrowing as he processed the extortion, the hired regulators, and the undeniable proof of Dutch's involvement. "Dutch is heavily protected," Horn muttered. "He runs the tables at the Elephant Corral on Larimer Street. He has the local deputies in his pocket." "He doesn't have you," Josie countered. "Tonight, my husband is going to walk through the front doors of the corral. Dutch will try to kill him. When he confesses to the Leadville murders and the train job to gloat, you and your agents will be listening from the back room. You get your prime target, and you wire the territorial governor to drop the false charges against my husband. It was a suicidal gamble, but Horn, driven by the prospect of a massive federal reward and vengeance for his fallen Pinkerton brothers, agreed. That night, Larimer Street was thick with coal smoke and the raucous noise of pianos and breaking glass. Gideon Hayes walked through the swinging doors of the Elephant Corral. The heavy canvas of his duster was swept back, revealing the twin Colt revolvers at his hips. The gambling hall went dead silent. Sitting at a high-stakes faro table in the back was Dutch Henry, born a heavily built man with a diamond stick pin and a cruel, easy smile. When he saw the scarred face of the man he had betrayed, his smile vanished. "I heard my men caught some lead-up in the high country," Dutch said loudly, standing up as his personal guards leveled their shotguns at Gideon. "Should have known you were too stubborn to die, Silas. You sent killers to my home, Dutch." Gideon's voice carried over the silent room, a low, terrifying rumble. "You killed Sarah. You tried to kill my children, and you put the Union Pacific robbery on my head." Dutch laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Who's going to care? The law thinks you're a train robber. The deputies in this town work for me. I put those bullets in your wife, and I'll put a bullet in you right here, and no one will say a damn word." "I will," a voice echoed from the shadows of the rear office. Thomas Horn stepped into the light, followed by 4 Pinkerton agents armed with repeating rifles. "We heard enough, Henry. We have the letters you sent the regulators. You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah McCall, the Union Pacific robbery, and conspiracy to commit murder across territorial lines." Dutch roared in fury, reaching for his shoulder holster, but he was too slow. Gideon drew with blinding speed, not to kill, but to disarm. His bullet shattered Dutch's right wrist. The crime boss collapsed, screaming in agony, as the Pinkertons swarmed him. The nightmare was finally over. As for John Miller, his treacherous plan backfired spectacularly. When he went to the bank in Topeka expecting a wire transfer of blood money, he found Thomas Horn waiting for him instead. The Pinkertons seized the Miller farm as evidence in a federal racketeering case. John Miller was sentenced to 15 years in the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, dying a broken, penniless man who had traded his daughter for nothing. Gideon was officially cleared of all charges by the Wyoming Territorial Governor, thanks to Horn's testimony and Dutch's confiscated ledgers. Josie and Gideon returned to the San Juan Mountains, no longer hiding from the world. They used the remaining gold from Gideon's safe-cracking days to buy 3,000 acres of prime grazing land in the valley below their old cabin. They built a sprawling ranch, raised cattle, and watched Caleb and Cora grow into strong, capable frontier adults. They had started as a desperate bargain between a ruined farmer and a hunted killer. But standing on the porch of their ranch years later, watching the sun set over the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Rockies, Josie Hayes knew the truth. They hadn't just survived the Wild West, they had conquered it, forging a love story out of dust, gunpowder, and an unbreakable will to protect their own. Josie Miller's harrowing journey from a bartered teenage bride to a fierce frontier matriarch remains a testament to human resilience. Thrown into a deadly web of deceit, bounties, and vengeance, she refused to be a victim. Together, she and the scarred mountain man built an empire from the ashes of betrayal, proving that family isn't just born from blood, it is fiercely chosen and defended against all odds.
Hi, my name is Ivy Dark Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Dark Devotion. After watching the video, sent at 18 to a widowed mountain man with 2 children, what followed shocked everyone. I really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the emotional weight of being thrown into a completely unfamiliar life at such a young age. There's something deeply moving about watching someone step into responsibility, uncertainty, and a family that's already carrying grief and loss. I think that's what gave the story its emotional pull. Beneath the mountain setting, it really felt like a story about healing, trust, and finding connection when nobody expected it. Do you think the young woman was stronger than she realized from the beginning? Or did the experience slowly change her over time? And why do you think stories about unexpected families and second chances resonate so strongly with people? I think stories like this remind us that life rarely unfolds the way we imagine, but meaningful relationships can sometimes grow out of the hardest situations. If this story stayed with you emotionally, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional mountain man stories filled with heart, resilience, and unexpected connection, feel free to like and subscribe only if you'd like to see more.